Jesus wasn't redeeming Israel. What was he doing on the cross? But their understanding of redemption was kick the Romans out, sovereignty. That was not what Jesus had come to achieve. So we need to read the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus. We need to see the smiling face of Jesus on every page of the Old Testament.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you know the statement of Paul when he's discussing some of those issues, and then he concludes, and therefore all Israel will be saved. Many would say that this applies to the, I don't know, the conversion of all Israel at the end. I tend to believe that he's actually talking about what you have been talking about, is everyone who is in Christ.
Yes, exactly. The church hasn't replaced Israel. The church is Israel. Israel and the church are two parts of the one people of God. If we'd been born in the 10th century BC or the 5th century BC, and the Spirit of God had been working in our hearts, we would have aligned ourselves with the Jews, with the revelation of God at that time. If we'd been alive at the time of Christ, God willing, we would have recognized Jesus as our Messiah, and the Gentiles were welcomed into the people of God, just as they were from the very beginning. You know, when Jesus threw out the money changers, he cites Isaiah, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. It wasn't for the Jews only, it was for all nations. So the church is Israel. The two are one. Just one verse that makes sense of this. In in John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. But then in Romans 11, it talks about the olive tree, the natural branches, Israel, the wild shoots, the Gentiles. He warns the Roman believers, don't be arrogant, because if the natural branches have been cut off, you can be cut off as well. But it talks about, it says the Gentiles have been grafted in. The question is, what have we been grafted into? Does God have one people or two? It's the one people of God. So Gentiles have been grafted in along with Jews into the one people of God. It was true in the Old Testament. It's true in the New. One people of God.
On account of everything you have said, filtering everything to Jesus, how do we understand those hard places in the Old Testament? And we have to admit that there are some tough places that kind of, Lord help me, I would prefer that they're not there, you know.
I liken the New Testament to a cheese grater. You know, a cheese grater, it has lots of holes in it. The Old Testament is a lump of cheese. You use a cheese grater and it comes out in little pieces. It's still the same cheese, but it's been transformed by the cheese grater. Jesus is central. So I encourage Christians to read the Gospels and see how Jesus handled the dominant interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures of his day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There was arrogance, there was supremacism, there was materialism, there was corruption. Jesus challenged them head on. Within his own band of disciples, Jesus had someone who'd worked for the Romans. He'd got some fishermen. He'd got some zealots. The zealots were the terrorists. The zealots were the ones who believed that they could reclaim the land, defeat the Romans by force, and create the kingdom that Jesus was supposedly going to rule over. You know, are you the one who's going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They ask him as he's about to ascend to heaven. You know, Calvin says there are more errors in the question than there are words. You know, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? If Jesus wasn't building the kingdom, you know, what was he doing? On the road to Emmaus, you see the disciples downcast, and Jesus says to them, why are you so discouraged? They said, well, don't you know what happened in Jerusalem about the one we had hoped was going to redeem Israel? If Jesus wasn't redeeming Israel, what was he doing on the cross? But their understanding of redemption was kick the Romans out, sovereignty. That was not what Jesus had come to achieve. So we need to read the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus. We need to see the smiling face of Jesus on every page of the Old Testament. And another way to make sense of the tough parts, which you refer to, those tough bits. On the one hand, I put them to the side and I say, when we get to heaven, we can ask Jesus about those bits. But at the same level, remember when they're on the lakeside after the resurrection, John turns, I think, is it John? He turns to Jesus, what about him? Meaning he wanted to know what was going to happen to his colleague. And Jesus says, it's not up to you. You know, I've got plans for him. What matters is how you follow me. And that's how we should understand our calling. Jesus has called us to be peacemakers, not widow makers. He's called us to a ministry of reconciliation, not confrontation. So if my theology leads to confrontation, I'm not following Jesus. So it's not about getting our theology right. It's about following Jesus and leaving the tough bits till later. Another principle I've learned in terms of hermeneutics is grace, presumption, and the biblical norm. Grace, presumption, the biblical norm. When things happened in history, recorded in scripture, like dashing the children, dashing them against the rocks and so on, if that happened, then we have to set it aside as a unique event. Presumption is when we believe we can do it again. The biblical norm is that we live out the Sermon on the Mount, meekness, kindness, gentleness, the fruit of the Spirit, seeking to turn our enemies into followers of Jesus, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us. That's our mandate, not replicating what may have happened on one instance 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. So I put those tough bits to the side and I focus on what it means to follow Jesus today and how the New Testament interprets those, the Hebrew scriptures. As I've just shown you from Galatians 3, Jesus is the seed. You cannot say Israel is the seed, full stop.
Thank you very much for this. I think this is very important, and I know for myself. Yes. And when I behold the face of God in Jesus, whatever happened there, I know who real God is, what he really looks like. And you have described him well. He is about kindness and about generosity, about love, about empathy, and anything that goes along with this. But I would like us now to move towards like the final stages of our conversation that I'm really enjoying and say something about the consequences of bad theology, because it seems to me, and I'm looking here the American scene, to put it like this, Christian and political scene, and I see how it's kind of going on to the rest of the world, because I know Christians, my friends, evangelicals who live even there in the Balkans and who are so much into Israel because they have been under the influence of evangelical leaders. I don't know whether it's fair to mention their names. One of them is like Franklin Graham, and they think if he believes that, then that's the truth from God. Not enough credit is being given to bad theology in shaping of American domestic and international politics. And when you mention that the strongest power when it comes to Zionism are Christians, this explains it. And if you follow and if you listen the statements, especially now, of some people emerging onto the scene, it's scary. Quite humanly speaking, it's scary. This leads me to a question which is already obvious, and this is, bad theology is also to blame for the human sacrifices who are being killed for no reason but for ideological reasons.
I agree with you. I mean, this is why I use strong words like blasphemy to describe Christian Zionism. When Jesus was standing before Pilate, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Christian Zionists say, oh, yes, it is. Christian Zionists are trying to force the kingdom. Gershon Solomon is one of the Temple Mount faithful leaders committed to rebuilding the Jewish temple over the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And his theology is not that dissimilar from Christian Zionism. He says, the Messiah will not come by himself. We must bring him by fighting. The idea that as we step out in faith and defeat our enemies, God will deliver us. God will vindicate us. That's precisely what the Zealots believed, what they believed on Masada when they were holding out against the Roman Empire. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. It's a fundamental mistake which Christian Zionists make. But as you said, theology has feet. What we believe affects how we behave. And Christian Zionism has its theology and it has its practice. And I want to develop this a little bit more. But to do so, I want to use another analogy. Francis Schaeffer was once asked, if you had 15 minutes with an atheist, what would you say? He said, I would use most of that time to push them to the logical conclusions of their belief system. Like a rubber band, you have to stretch them, push them to the end, and then they will bounce back when they realize how destructive their theology has become. And the tragedy is that most Christian Zionists don't know how destructive their theology is because they haven't seen the consequences of it. They haven't seen the separation wall, the apartheid wall. They haven't seen the military roadblocks, the Palestinian villages polluted by the water effluent flowing from the settlements. They haven't been into Gaza and sat alongside, the orphans. They haven't gone in the ambulances. They're not aware because they only watch the sanitized version. It's like a PlayStation game. Israel is like a PlayStation game. We can, the blood isn't real. That it's a fiction. But let me just unpack what the theology, how the theology affects facts on the ground. Because Christian Zionists believe they must bless Israel and support Israel, that's why they put a lot of their emphasis into lobbying US politicians on behalf of Israel. Alongside AIPAC, you have Bridges for Peace, Christian Friends of Israel, International Christian Embassy, Christians United for Israel. Their emphasis is on lobbying congressmen and senators, the president, on behalf of Israel. Even Trump, when he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, he said, what really surprised me was the Jews weren't that enthusiastic. It was the Christians who were enthusiastic. So blessing Israel is translated as lobbying on behalf of Israel. If you believe the Jews are God's chosen people, then you will protect them, you'll defend them, you'll advocate for them, and you will facilitate their return from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from other parts of the world. So the Aliyah program, the emigration of Jews from other parts of the world into Palestine, is being facilitated by Christian organizations. The International Christian Embassy will hire planes to bring in Jewish emigres. If you believe God has given them everything from Egypt to Iraq, then you're going to support the settlements. The settlement program, these are really colonies in the occupied West Bank. We're going to see settlements again in Gaza very soon. The settlements in Golan. There are Christian organizations which are funding the settlement program. Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, CFOIC is just one of them. They will buy armor-plated buses to help bus people out of the settlements into Jerusalem and so on. If you believe that Jerusalem is the eternal undivided capital of Israel, then you move the US embassy. It's, you think, what on earth has this got to do with moving an embassy? But if the embassy of the United States is moved to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, everyone else is pressured to do the same. Until now, there have been no embassies in Jerusalem. They have consulates in East Jerusalem, consulates in West Jerusalem, because internationally we recognize Israel is illegally occupying East Jerusalem. The embassies are in Tel Aviv. So by moving the US embassy to Jerusalem and parking it in Palestine, it's in a sense, it's saying Jerusalem is exclusively Israeli. Many Christian Zionists believe the temple's got to be rebuilt before Christ can return. And because of that, the Temple Mount Faithful and the Temple Movement and other Zionist organizations committed to destroying the Dome of the Rock are funded and supported by Christian churches. Because their eschatology, their view of the future, is destructive, we're heading for a war of Armageddon, then they, on the one hand, demonize Palestinians and Arabs and anyone who opposes them. They accuse those of us who are committed to human rights of being anti-Semites. You know, it's a badge of honor to be accused of being an anti-Semite if you are committed to the best interests of Jews and Palestinians. If you're committed to human rights, you're committed to Palestinian and Israeli human rights, but you become an anti-Semite if you oppose Israel. So their eschatology is deeply destructive. You know, they're promoting sending weapons to Israel, for example, pressuring the US president to continue to do that. So this is how their theology is translated into their political agenda. It's deeply destructive, and in my view, it's heresy, it's blasphemy.
Until recently, I thought I had a clear picture of what anti-Semitism was, or anti-Semitism was. Hating Jews for no reason, just to simplify the answer. But now they are telling us that simply criticizing what the state of Israel is doing is actually an act of anti-Semitism. Or if you express your empathy towards Palestinian people, this is becoming suddenly anti-Semitism. Could you elaborate maybe quickly? Because
Sure.
it is an important problem today.
It is. Words are very important. Getting them right is very important. Anti-Semitism is anathema. It's racism. It's simply a form of racism, and it is evil. It's abhorrent. It's prejudice, hostility, antipathy towards Jews because they are Jews. It's identical to hostility, animosity, prejudice toward Muslims because they're Muslims, or blacks because they're blacks. It's simply a form of supremacism, the idea that we are different, we are superior, they are not, and therefore we can persecute them, we treat them differently. Anti-Semitism is wrong, and we must always oppose it. What has happened in the last 20 years or so is anti-Semitism has been redefined, it's been weaponized, and this is in part by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition, IHRA working definition. It was put together in Europe as a discussion document, as an attempt to apply the definition of anti-Semitism to real life situations, to help refute anti-Semitism, which is all good reasons. But what happened was, in the formulation and in its promotion, it has rubbed out the edges, the clear lines between racism and anti-racism. It has redefined, as you said, anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel. And the logic is very simple. Israel is now a Jewish state. That's how it's defined. Citizenship is for Jews only. All Jews in the world are entitled to Israeli citizenship. They are seen as the collective Jew. Therefore, if you criticize Israel, you're criticizing Jews. Therefore, it's anti-Semitism. But the irony is that it was never intended as a legal definition. It was a working definition, a work in progress, unfinished. And yet it's been solidified and weaponized and is being used to silence criticism of Israel. It falls at the very first hurdle of a definition. It is indefinite. The first sentence says anti-Semitism may include ... That word may is contingent. It means that it is indefinite, and you cannot have an indefinite definition. By definition, a definition has to be definite. And therefore, the word may, by including that word may in the very first sentence, means that you've got to use something else to determine whether it is or is not anti-Semitism. So it's not a definition, but that's precisely how Zionists want it. They want to make it like a fog. You know, you're driving your car and you enter a fog. You don't know where the next car is. You have to slow down. They want to rub out the lines because they want to make it ambiguous. They want to make it ambiguous so that you will not criticize Israel for fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. So it's very important that we keep to a traditional understanding of what anti-Semitism is. It's racism, prejudice, hostility, antipathy toward Jews because they are Jews. And that's wrong. It's evil. I've always opposed it. But let's not allow the ambiguity of the IHR working definition to be weaponized and used to silence criticism of Israel in universities, in churches, in mosques, and so on. Otherwise, we're doing their work for them.
Humanly speaking, the future, at least the most immediate future, doesn't look very bright. I'm thinking from the perspective of what is happening in this country, how things are changing after the elections, the people who seems to be now coming into the picture to form the president's cabinet. I know many of them where they're standing, and I'm thinking, my Lord, help us. You know, we already have a person who I think has been nominated to become the ambassador in Israel, and his statements are rather radical, at least certainly in my view, and the future doesn't look bright. What is your projection? Where we are heading, or potentially heading, and then how can we, Christians, who see it the way you are seeing it, make a difference?
Definition of a pessimist. Pessimist is an optimist with information. The more information we have about the future, the more pessimistic we become. People give me books to read all the time, and I'll tell you what I do. I turn to the last page and I read the last page. And if I like the ending, I might read the book. If I don't like the ending, why waste my time reading a book? You know, the heroine dies on the last page. Well, I like to read the last page of the Bible. And the last page of the Bible tells us what's going to happen. And Revelation 22, 1 and 2 says, well, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. However we understand our end times theology, and when we read the newspapers, it can look pretty bleak. We must keep that last image in our minds, the healing of the nations. The assumption is that the nations exist. We haven't all been nuked. The nations exist, and God's will and purpose is that there is healing and reconciliation. You know, the beginning of Revelation 21, the image is that God is dwelling with his people. There'll be no more war, no more suffering, no more death, no more pain. The old order of things has passed away. That's our vision of the future, and that's what should keep us alive, get us up in the morning, and motivate us to use every sinew in our bodies, every breath that we have, to use our limited time on earth to follow Jesus, to know Jesus and make Jesus known by our words, but by our actions, and only use words when necessary. So for me, it goes right back to that first question you asked about motivation and activism. Faith without works is dead, says James. Faith without works is dead. And so how we live out our faith is how people will see our faith in action. So as we look at what's happening right now, I am no doubt that Trump will be consistent with the Trump that we already know, and the conflict in the Middle East will continue. The suffering in Gaza will continue unless and until the international community stands up to the US, challenges Israel. What can we as little people do? Well, we can use boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. We can boycott Israeli goods. We can boycott Western goods that are sold in and benefit the settlement program. We can support the work of the International Criminal Court, support the work of the International Court of Justice, speak out against apartheid, name Israel for what it is, an apartheid regime committing genocide and ethnic cleansing, join the marches that are global. We have one in London every month. Hundreds of thousands of people turn out every month to show their solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Palestine. I'm part of a coalition of folk who are gearing up for our campaign next year, which will be to see Israel expelled from the United Nations. We've got to go for the jugular. Israel was recognized by the UN in 1948 on the condition that Palestinians would have the right of return. Israel's never complied with that condition. Therefore, it has failed to fulfill its obligations that were the requirement for its recognition as a state. So I will be calling for the revoking of Israel's presence within the United Nations. Boycotts, divestments, and sanctions worked in South Africa, and it can work in Palestine today. But Jesus has called us to be peacemakers and ambassadors. And an ambassador serves on foreign soil. That's how we should view the world today. We're on foreign soil. We're ambassadors of Christ, but we keep ahead of us that vision that we find at the end of the book of Revelation of where we're headed. That should motivate us every day that God has given us.
Reverend Stephen Sizer, thank you very much for this interview and for this conversation, which I believe is a critically crucial one and important, because it is not being covered sufficiently, neither in our churches, neither through public media, neither through social media. There are some powerful voices like yourself who are doing this, but we need to hear more, because people need to be warned about the dangers of deception that comes out from Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism, and dispensationalism.